I'm having trouble making sense of the events that have happened to me this week. I'm not sure what I'm looking for by posting this story. The more I think about it, the less I want it to make sense. My dad was my hero. I idolized that man growing up. No matter what got him down or what problems he was struggling with, he always had a smile on his face for me. I think that's the reason why what happened doesn't make any sense to me. My mom was also great. At heart, I was a complete mommy's boy and always have been. I would do anything to make sure she was happy. One day, something changed in her. She seemed withdrawn, as if something was troubling her. I overheard her one night talking to my nan on the phone. I'm sure she suspected my dad of cheating on her, something I think would be unforgivable. She complained to my nan about a strange odor coming from his clothes. I didn't want to believe it. Maybe he was just working harder than usual. I decided it would be best if I confronted him. Maybe I thought I could handle the truth better than my mother could. I think I just needed to know for myself. My mom was cooking dinner while I sat at the table, waiting. My dad, who was normally never late for dinner, was now over an hour late. As we ate, I could see my mom glancing over at the empty plate where my dad would sit and then glancing up at the clock. I kept my mouth shut about it because I didn't want to embarrass my mom by telling her I knew what was going on. He was over 2 hours late before he finally snuck in the back door. As I went to get up from the table, he glanced at me with a nervous smile before he disappeared down into the basement. This wasn't something my dad did, and now I was sure something wasn't right. As I made my way down the narrow steps into the basement, I began to notice that unusual smell my mother had talked about. It was hard to describe. It smelled like the crusty old sock behind my bed that my mom was scared to touch, and the musty odor that only comes from an old folks' home. As I slowly made my way down the stairs, I could hear my dad on the phone, crying uncontrollably, begging someone for forgiveness. I made it to the last step, forgetting that it made a loud creak. When it alerted my dad to my presence, the usual bright smile he had for me was replaced with a hate-filled glare. He bared his teeth at me like a rabid animal before lunging at me. He was too quick for me to react and caught me by the scruff of my jumper. The anger on his face terrified me to my core. I didn't recognize my father at that moment, but the look of fear on my face snapped him back to his senses, and he wrapped his arms around me as if ashamed of what had just happened. As he held me, he looked down at the phone in his other hand. I could swear I heard someone laughing loudly on the other end. Without warning, my dad stopped hugging me and slithered back into the dark corner of the basement, sobbing. The next day, I followed my dad to work. I sat in the coffee shop across from the building he worked in, waiting for him to finish. As I sat there, I prayed my dad was cheating. I prayed that whatever the reason for my dad's behavior was, it was something that made sense. I sat and watched as he left for home. He was on the phone with that same disturbed look he had in the basement. He would glance down at his watch as he went in the opposite direction of home. I knew I had to keep following him, but I was terrified of what I was going to discover. He was on the phone the whole time I followed. I followed for about 20 minutes until he came to a rundown, dilapidated house. All I could think about was my distraught mother at home wondering about her husband as he walked up the steps to the house. I watched as my father let himself into the house. I walked nervously up to the steps of the house. It was now or never, and I was determined to get to the bottom of this. If I had to, I was going to catch him in the act. I wasn't going to give him the chance to talk himself out of it. I walked up to the door and banged on the knocker as hard and angrily as I could. I stood there for what felt like hours, waiting for someone to open the door, before I decided to move around to the back of the house. As I passed one of the windows, something caught my eye in one of the downstairs windows. To my complete horror, it was my dad sitting on a chair in an empty room. He looked terrified and was crying uncontrollably. I banged on the window trying to get his attention, but he completely ignored me. I could see him looking at something, and whatever it was, he looked horrified. I couldn't understand why he didn't get up and run. He wasn't tied to the chair or bound in any way, and for some reason he was in his bare feet. As I screamed for him to move, as I suddenly saw what my dad was looking at. Whatever it was, it crawled towards him. It moved unnaturally as it dragged itself slowly across the floor. The thing almost looked human, but had long hair that covered parts of its skeletal, naked body. It kept moving towards my dad. He looked so scared as it edged itself closer to him. The closer it got, the more my dad cried. I tried breaking the window, but the rocks just bounced off it. My dad seemed resigned to his fate as it inched closer. The creature sniffed the ground as if it was trying to find something, but stopped when it got to my dad's feet. My dad didn't look scared anymore as the creature started licking his feet. He laughed uncontrollably as the creature's long, slimy, snake-like tongue slithered all over my dad's feet. The more the creature licked my dad's feet, the more he laughed. He laughed so much he began pissing himself as it got too much for him. I was sure my dad was going to laugh himself to death. I couldn't hear what was going on, but suddenly a little girl walked into the room. The old, creepy-looking child seemed physically scared of the little girl and backed away into the corner of the room. She walked over to my dad and began collecting his tears in a small glass vial. It was killing me seeing my father like this, and I didn't understand why he didn't just get up and run. I was trying to think of a plan to get my dad out of the house when suddenly I caught that same smell I had noticed from my dad in the basement. Before I could turn to see where the smell was coming from, something hit me in the head and my lights went out. When I finally came to, it was dark out and the house seemed empty. I made my way home, hoping to find my dad there, and that maybe everything I had witnessed was just some horrible dream. When I arrived home, I was surprised to see the light on in the kitchen. As I opened the kitchen door, I was hit with that horrible smell again. The smell was pungent, but this time it wasn't my dad. It was my mother, and she was huddled under the table with the same distraught look on her face that my father had. She was on the phone, crying hysterically and apologizing to someone. I quickly grabbed the phone from her hand and demanded that whoever was on the other end tell me who it was. The sound of a little girl's voice laughing down the phone at me. As I begged them to leave us alone, the phone suddenly went dead. Suddenly, the girl spoke in an eerie manner with urgency. Your mother's tears are going to taste so much sweeter than your father's.